Good morning. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and with my colleague Stephen Rothstein of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, we welcome you and so excited to have you with us for this JFK Space Fest. Also, a warm welcome to those of you who are with us online and watching today's speaker program from a distance. I'd like to thank the Raytheon Company for its lead sponsorship of today's events and programs, as well as the Boeing Company and Vertex Pharmaceuticals for their support of today's program. I would also like to acknowledge the support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, Gourmet Catering, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. And we thank all of you for joining us in person today, for silencing your cell phones for the program. That would be most helpful. Today's JFK Space Fest at the library honors President Kennedy's contributions to space exploration. I'd like to ask a question of the young people in the audience here today. Can anybody tell me why we are celebrating JFK with Apollo and the moon? Yes. Yes, because he wanted all of us to go to the moon. Very good. President Kennedy challenged this nation to put a human being on the moon by the end of the 1960s and return them safely to Earth. Let's hear directly what he had to say about this.
There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Today, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the moon landing and the more than 400,000 people who worked to make this milestone human achievement in space a reality. We are so pleased that many people with ties to the Apollo and Mercury missions are celebrating in person with us today, including the families of local women who helped weave the copper wire into the circuits for the Apollo guidance computer and their supervisor. Might I ask all of you with ties to the Apollo program to stand or wave so we may acknowledge your service. You should talk to them later, they're amazing. During today's celebration, in addition to our full program of speakers here in Smith Hall, we hope you will enjoy the space-related activities and hands-on programming throughout the building. And don't miss the Space Gallery exhibit in our museum, that features the actual spacecraft flown by Alan Shepard, the first American in space, the Freedom 7. You can also explore our Milestones and Mementos exhibit that has a section on JFK and NASA. We now have a special greeting from NASA astronauts Nick Hague and Christina Koch aboard the International Space Station, who couldn't be with us here today, but wanted to send best wishes to everyone.
Good day. I'm NASA astronaut Nick Hague, aboard the International Space Station with my NASA crewmate, Christina Koch. To everyone at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, we welcome you to our amazing orbital laboratory.
We're so glad we can join you today for this special commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing of the lunar module Eagle, one of the greatest achievements in human history. We will never forget President Kennedy's words that inspired the nation to accomplish the goal of landing a human on the moon and to expand humanity's reach through the exploration of space.
As we honor President Kennedy's contribution to the U.S. space program and the historic significance of Apollo 11, we hope you will also enjoy learning more about our work at NASA. And perhaps one day, one of you will be part of the space program as well.
Quick survey, how many of you want to grow up and be astronauts? Yeah. And to the astronauts who are going to speak, if you could say something about that little plaque that says, "Do not touch," I'm curious about that. I'm now honored to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Franklin Chang Díaz. He has served as chairman of Ad Astra Rocket Company, board and chief executive officer since July of 2005, formerly an astronaut with NASA for 25 years, and a veteran of 7 space shuttle flights. He holds a PhD in plasma physics from MIT and is the inventor of the Variable Specific Impulse Magnetoplasma Rocket Engine, the VASIMR engine. Dr. Chang Díaz is the author of Dream's Journey and To Mars and Beyond Fast. There will be a chance to ask Dr. Chang Díaz questions following his presentation. Please help me welcome Dr. Chang Díaz.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming to this wonderful celebration of an event which really transformed many people's lives. And I wanted to point out to you that the words of President Kennedy more than 50 years ago resonated much beyond the borders of the United States. This was not just a U.S. endeavor, but it was a world endeavor. And I was a young boy at the time, wanting to be an astronaut, and I wanted to join this in the United States. And so I wanted to walk you a little bit through that period of time, what it was like when Neil stepped down from the lunar module, stepped on the moon, and what happened since, and what do I think is going to happen in the next 50 years from now. So let me give you a little feel for where was I, and maybe think about where those of you who were alive, where were you at that moment when Neil stepped off the ladder. I had already arrived in the United States, and I was at the University of Connecticut. It was the summer, so I was just starting a little bit earlier than the regular course, because I had come to the US the year before, and I did not speak English. and I was just learning the language. I had come to the US because I wanted to be an astronaut, and convinced my father to send me on give me a one-way ticket to the United States, and he did. He said, well, Franklin, listen, you know, I cannot really afford to, to send you to the United States to study, but I will give you the plane ticket. And he gave me a one-way ticket. And he said, the reason I give you that is not just because I can't afford the return, it's because I know how hard this is going to be. And if you have the return ticket, you will be back. And I want you to have to work really hard. And if you do get into a lot of trouble, just write. And of course, we didn't have the internet in those days, and writing a letter would take a long time. It would take a long time to get there. It would take a long time for them to come back to me. And he figured that by then the crisis would have already abated. And so, but it was a good plan. So, and I have to tell you that if I had that return ticket, I would have used it. I would have gone back because it was hard. So let me give you a feel. I had come the year before from Costa Rica. That's my home country. That's where I was born. And ever since Sputnik, I dreamed about becoming a space explorer. And, there were no astronauts in Sputnik days, but shortly after that, the first astronauts were selected by NASA, and we also knew that there were cosmonauts being trained in the then Soviet Union. But there were only two countries in this game, only the Soviet Union and the United States. That was it. It was a chemistry of confrontation. And the rest of us were just sitting in the bleachers, watching this duel, I guess, or competition in the sky for supremacy between those two superpowers. And I just had to get into this game. And I had written a letter to NASA back in 1967 asking Dr. von Braun, who was the head of the rocket program at NASA, how could I participate? Because I was going to graduate from high school in that year. And a few months later, I got this letter, which you can see it here. And of course, I couldn't read this letter because it's in English. And so I had it translated. But someone at NASA took the trouble to underline the last sentence in the second paragraph there. And the translator translated this letter to me. He said, careers at NASA were only available to US citizens. And I totally misunderstood the intent of the statement. I thought what he was trying to tell me was, come on over to the US and become a citizen, and then you'll get a job. And so, okay, I'm on. So I emigrated to the US back in '68 and started this journey. Of course, the space program, soon after the landing on the moon, President Nixon canceled the program, and my professors at the University of Connecticut said to me, Franklin, don't even think about going into space or space program because you'll never get a job. And that's because there were thousands of aerospace engineers out of work because the space program had been canceled. It was almost 5% of the national budget, and it went down to about a fraction of that in a matter of a couple of years. And so I'm glad I didn't listen to that advice. I went, however, to MIT and took a little detour into the field of plasma physics, because at the time, in the early 70s, there was an energy crisis in the United States and the whole world, and everybody was interested in energy. And nuclear power was a very up-and-coming technology, and particularly the promise of thermonuclear fusion. That is the promise of the hydrogen process that powers the sun. And so I did that. Went to what happened? It's just it's a technical problem. In Houston, we have a problem. So, yes, usually what happens is, okay, well, I'll just, don't worry about it. We got to figure it out. Anyway, so I went to MIT and I started working in the fusion program, thinking that someday plasma physics and nuclear power would have an important role to play in space. That is, to power the rockets that would take us not to the moon only, but beyond. Go to Mars and the deep planets, deep into the solar system. So time passed. The Apollo program was over. Skylab took place. We flew Skylab, and then the Apollo-Soyuz missions, also the one flight took place. It was sort of a lull. And all of a sudden, in 1977, the space shuttle came to life. And that is not in space, but it was flown from a big airplane, a 747, and they started doing the approach and landing tests where they would drop the space shuttle Enterprise from the 747, and it would just glide over the Edwards dry lake bed in the Mojave Desert, and they would land it and go for a touchdown to make sure that this thing could really fly in the atmosphere. So at that moment, NASA issued a call for another group of astronauts. Okay, another group of astronauts, and that was 1978. I applied, and the one requirement that I had not accomplished yet was that I was not yet a U.S. citizen, but it was just in the process of doing that. That same day, same year, 1977, I took the oath of allegiance, and I became a proud American right here in Boston at the City Hall. And thank you. Sent my application and was summarily rejected. So all that means to me is that you just have to try again. And so I sort of took my time. I was working at Draper Labs, and I was working on fusion power. And sure enough, a couple of years after that, lo and behold, another call from NASA requesting applications from American citizens for a new group of astronauts for the space shuttle program. And that was my call. I sent the application, which I had already in the file, just updated it a little bit, sent it over. And a couple of months later, I got called. I got a call to go for an interview. And I knew that once you get called from an interview, that means that you are withered down from thousands of applications down to the hundreds. And so it was like 3,500 applicants, and I was down to the group of 120. That sounded pretty interesting. So I went to NASA at the Johnson Space Center, went through all the application exams and evaluations, and in May of 1980, I was selected in the 9th group of astronauts. And you see, I guess I'm the second, yeah, I don't even recognize myself. So it's the second one. The second one in the bottom row from the left here. I'm right next to Charlie Bolden, who eventually also, you know, he and I both got interviewed at the same time, and he became the administrator of NASA. I mean, who would know? Who would have known that? He was the administrator for several years, and Dan Burbank, who's going to speak next, is not in that group, but is coming later. So he's got a similar story. So anyway, fast forward, we, you know, did a lot of stuff. 50 years from the Apollo program, the program matured. I better make sure that this thing works here. Yeah. We learned to fly this thing and to do a lot of really sophisticated work. Assembly of the International Space Station was a remarkable achievement. There were pieces that were manufactured in many different countries. They had never been fitted together on Earth. The first time they saw each other or one another was in space. And it all came together surprisingly fault-free. It was an incredible thing. And so we have become essentially a spacefaring species. And I just want to make sure this thing. So you can see here the space shuttle in relation to the International Space Station. The space shuttle is a big spacecraft, and the space station is even bigger. We're talking about something on the scale of a football field in size, and about 400 metric tons of hardware orbiting the Earth at 7.5 or 8 kilometers a second, you know, going around every 90 minutes, with human beings living there. We have been living in space non-stop since the beginning of the century, since 1999. And so we are now poised for going beyond. This is also what has happened in the Earth. We used to have only a handful of satellites orbiting the Earth way back. Now we got about 500,000 of these things, and most of these things are dead. And there are more coming up. Now they're sending swarms of these satellites. Each one of these satellites is moving at velocities which are 7 or 8 kilometers a second. So we have a real problem of orbital debris and essentially overcrowding of the orbital space. So somebody's going to have to clean that up. And so these are the kinds of things that are coming down the line. So space has become really not just a place of exploration, but it has become a place of business. And this is really good. This is what makes the whole process be sustainable and be really, people have the profit motive, and now a lot of people get into it. The private sector gets into this. And now you can see, for example, the International Space Station right there at the bottom. That's a real anchor point. But there's other ideas of bringing private space stations. We're even talking about mining asteroids. You see up in the upper left, up there, you know, asteroids that are full of precious minerals, water. Water is a very important consumable for space, and we intend to mine that for for profit. The other thing is that many other countries are also involved in this game. So it is not just the US and Russia as it used to be, but now we have many nations, and it's a growing group of nations moving into space. So the problem that we are facing, though, is the transportation problem. And this is a problem that we've had for 50 years and even before, in that we have been relying on chemical rockets to do all of this work for us. And if you picture the Apollo Saturn V rocket, here it is broken in pieces here, you can see that most of that ship is fuel. Very little of what of the rocket itself is useful payload. And what actually got back to Earth was a little tiny capsule on the top. So the payload is very low. And that's just going to the moon, 250,000 miles away, pretty much in our backyard. And we want to be able to go throughout the entire neighborhood, to the whole of space. We want to be able to move through all of the solar system with human beings. Well, how do we do that? The propulsion systems we have today are not capable of doing that. We have to move to a paradigm shift in rocket propulsion and rocket transportation, so that we, which are only operating in the upper left here, low Earth orbit, cislunar, what we call cislunar, is all chemical propulsion. We now want to go beyond to Mars and beyond to the planets, to the outer planets and their moons. And then eventually someday we will embark on an interstellar flight that requires completely different technology. So we are, in our company, and this is a project that I started at NASA, working on this sort of technology, and that's called the VASIMR. This is the engine that's in testing now in Houston. It is not a chemical rocket. It is an electric rocket. So we are moving to electric transportation in space as well as on Earth. A lot of people on Earth is moving to electricity. We're moving to electrical transportation also in space. And this is a rocket engine which, unlike the traditional electric rockets that we've had for many years, can process a huge amount of power. And that is what gives you the muscle to really go fast and efficiently in space. So how do you power electrically something in space? You have two choices. You either use solar power or you use nuclear power. You know, both of these are available. Clearly, near the Earth and the Moon, solar power is plentiful. But if you are going to go to Mars, or you're going to go to Jupiter or beyond, the sun is just going to be a bright star, not going to give you very much solar energy. You are going to be needing nuclear reactors. And that technology needs to be addressed. This is something that is that cannot be delayed any further. We should have started that 50 years ago, and we didn't. A lot of it is controversial because people worry about nuclear power, but without it, we will not survive in space. So it is a fundamental question that people are going to have to wrestle with. This is the VASIMR engine in schematic. You can see there on the upper right a sort of a cartoon of how this engine, the rocket works. It's no longer a chemical mixture of chemical reactions there, but now we're talking about plasma. Now, plasma is nothing but a super hot gas, like the sun. When you heat a gas to temperatures like the sun, the atoms of these gas kind of break up a little bit and shed some of their electrical charges. And so you end up with a kind of like a alphabet soup of charged particles. negative and positive. You know, this is sort of a mixture of positive and negative particles, equal amounts of positive and negative, because if we have too much of many more of negatives, then the whole thing is negative. If you have too many positives, the whole thing is positive. So you got to have it all balanced out. So plasmas as a whole are neutral, but they are electrically conducting gases. Many of our lamps, plasma TVs, other devices that we use rely on this process. But the point here is that a plasma can be held very effectively inside a magnetic pipe. And a magnetic pipe has the advantage that it does not melt. So you don't have a limit to how hot you can make that plasma. And we make that plasma as hot as the sun. The plasma we are firing in our engine now is 5 million degrees. There's no material on the Earth or anywhere that we know that can sustain those temperatures. But we are able to control these kinds of temperatures in the laboratory now. So these rockets now have 10 times the performance of the best chemical rocket that we could ever build. And these are the rockets that will take us to Mars and beyond. This is an actual video of the VASIMR engine firing in Houston. Almost looks like a photograph, but it really isn't. It's a video. The engine is running here. You can see the plasma jet coming out of a magnetic enclosure, a magnetic nozzle. The plasma doesn't really touch the walls of the container. The only thing that touches the plasma is those sensors that you see passing back and forth. They're measuring the temperature, the speed, the performance of the jet, and they don't last very long. We keep them there only a few seconds, and then after a while they are not usable. Like you got to replace them. So this is how we measure the performance of these rockets. And so we're moving now to the deployment of this technology in various ways. First, because we are a private company, our investors say, well, you know, Franklin, you know, Mars is not really a very good business now. There's nobody there, you know. You're not going to sell very many rockets to go to Mars. But there is a big market now in the vicinity of Earth and the Moon. And that is all of those satellites and all of that trash that I showed you has to be dealt with. And our business is essentially the trucking business, the logistics business, you know, garbage collection, you name it. But you need a truck, and you need an engine on the truck to do that. So you can see here all of these potential areas of work. Eventually, as we mature, and as we go back to the Moon, where we can test much more powerful engines of this type in the vacuum of the Moon, then we will develop there the engines that will take us to Mars. And that is what we'll do. This is a little bit of a history that you see here, what has happened over the years. So you can see that we have been developing this propulsion system for almost as long as the Apollo landing on the Moon, for almost like 40 years, and we've been working on this. And it will be 50 years maybe before it's fully commercialized from the beginning. So now we're in this particular point. This is the first demo flight that we intend to do, probably in the year 2022, 2023. It's just a simple robotic flight to test the engine and verify that its performance is the same as it would be, as it is in the laboratory. And then we intend to deploy trucks like this one here that you see. And these are solar-powered ships that will power those engines to deliver cargo to the NASA's Lunar Gateway, the mini space station that they want to put orbiting around the Moon to start supplying permanent operations on the surface of the Moon. They will need supplies, logistics, and we intend to provide that. And then eventually we go now to the real big dream that maybe some of the youngsters here will see, and maybe even they will get to fly. This is a ship that is as big as the International Space Station. It will be assembled on the Lagrange point near the moon. It will not be assembled near the Earth. It will be assembled near the moon. And it will be nuclear powered. It will have nuclear, you can see up on the upper right, the reactors. There will be 4 of these reactors, each one producing about maybe something like 10 megawatts of power, something similar to a submarine, to a nuclear submarine. The ship has got some interesting features that I wanted to point out to you, especially those tanks that you see in the central core. Those are fuel tanks, and the fuel is hydrogen. It will be carried as liquid hydrogen. And liquid hydrogen is an excellent shield against the radiation of space, which is one of the problems that astronauts will face in a journey to Mars and beyond, is the radiation bombardment from cosmic rays. So these hydrogen tanks are going to be wrapped around the core of the ship so that people will be living in the inner core, in the inside. That would be the living quarters. But inside those hydrogen tanks, you can see here a little blowout of that structure. Those slinky-looking things, they look like wraps of slinky-like structures around the core. Those are superconducting magnets. And these are very powerful superconducting magnets that will provide a magnetic shield in addition to the hydrogen shield. So you'll have 2 shields to totally protect the crew against the radiation of space. And that is the way we would go to Mars, and we will arrive there healthy and be able to work. These are some mission parameters for you to ponder on. We even have a departure date in case you want to make reservations. So it would be 20th of May and 2035. I don't know if I'll be able to see it, but maybe I will, and maybe I'll be even on it. Who knows? One-way trip, maybe. Anyway, no, this would be a return flight, definitely. And you can see here the parameters. Power 40 megawatts is about 600 metric tons of vehicle, very, very big. It will have a lander which will land on Mars. And this is a sketch of the mission. And you can see from the various points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they're described here. They're a little bit, there's a little jargon here, but I'll give you a feel for number 1. The first thing we do is we depart from the moon sphere of influence, which is in the Earth gravitational sphere of influence. So we spiral around until we peel off from the gravity of the Earth. That means we leave from the Earth sphere of influence to transit to the Mars sphere of influence in item number 2. That takes 95 days, or 89 days. So the total so far from 1 to 2 to 3 is 95 days. When you get to the moon, you're coming in really fast because this is a very fast ship. You got to slow down, otherwise you miss Mars, and you don't want to do that. So you come in, and you separate. The lander will deploy big aerobraking bags, which will slow you down, land, but the mothership will continue on. And the mothership will arc around in item number 4, and it will take its time to come around and rejoin back on Mars on item 5, and we'll start slowing down and gradually lowering itself to about a 20,000 kilometer orbit around Mars. But by then, the crew has been on Mars for about 30 days. They are pretty much finished with their surface stay. Now they're ready to come back. They take off from Mars, dock with the mothership, and then on items 6 and 7, the ship then spirals out of Mars' sphere of influence and slings out to the Earth for another 90-day or 90-plus day journey. So this is the mission to Mars that we'd like to do. It's not the mission to Mars that is in the books right now, but this is the mission that we'd like to do. And we hope to convince NASA and maybe whoever wants to do this, that this is the way to go. So this is the last image that I have for you, and it's a photograph taken by the Mars Curiosity rover from Mars, obviously, on a evening, clear evening sky. And that little tiny point of light is the Earth. That's where we all are. And the reason I close with that is because I figured that maybe someday, I don't know, amateur astronomer on Mars looking at the evening sky will take a picture of, look at that little point of light and tell, you know, his or her son or daughter, hey, you know, your great-grandfather came from there. So I'll stop right there. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I don't know, are we supposed to open for questions, or is it a little too late? Yeah?
Do we have some questions for Dr. Franklin Chang Díaz? Question over there.
What was it like in space?
Well, space is a wonderful experience, you know. The most beautiful thing is just the sight of the planet, you know, the sight of the Earth, which is round the way they tell you in school. It is truly round. There are some people who say that it's flat, but it isn't. It's round. So it's just I highly recommend it. So.
Question to the left.
Students to get ready to go to space.
Franklin, if you would like to ask a question, we've got some microphones here. So we're going to answer this one for the teacher, and then others can gather at the microphones in the aisles.
Yeah.
Right.
Students to get ready to go to space is study really hard. You know, Mike Anderson, who died on the Columbia, he used to tell the students, you know, you're already training to be an astronaut. I mean, these little kids, you're already training for it. So you really got to pay attention and study hard. But the other thing I tell people is you got to be ready to fail. And you cannot be too worried about failure. I had a professor who used to tell me, Franklin, you know, if your experiment works perfectly, you've learned nothing. And he's right. To succeed, you have to fail. You have to learn to fail. And failure is part of the game. And just because, you know, this thing that they say about NASA, the failure is not an option, that was just a very specific case. But NASA is all about failure, excuse me, okay? So really, be ready to fail. Be okay with that. So, yeah.
What do you think of SpaceX?
What do you think of SpaceX?
SpaceX is great. I like SpaceX. I think SpaceX has really pushed the envelope and has really made people think about what's possible. There's some things that are a little bit, you know, maybe too much, but that's okay because you got to push the envelope. You gotta get out of your comfort zone, And I think SpaceX has pushed NASA and other agencies to get out of their comfort zone, and I think that's very good.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I have two questions. One is, if you could visit any moon or planet in our solar system, where would you go and why? And my second question is, if you think in our lifetime somehow it was not possible to have a round trip to Mars, would you support a one-way trip or only round trip?
Ooh. No, the one-way trip is not a good thing because, you know, on Mars, you know, you can't really breathe the air, and it's not very, you know, it's not so good. You know, it really not so good. I mean, it's not really fair to your loved ones, your families, and all the people that you leave behind. So, and I think there's no need for us to create a condition where you just have to go on one way. You got to be able to come back and tell the story. And we have the technology, and we can develop the technology to do that. So as far as the moons, I would go to Titan and Europa. Those are the most interesting ones so far that I've seen. And you know, on Titan, the atmosphere, you cannot breathe the atmosphere either, but the pressure is about right. So you don't need a pressure suit. You need a sweater, and you need to maybe put on a helmet. But and then Europa is probably hiding an ocean under the ice crust, and there may be life there. So I mean, it's really exciting, the stuff that's about to happen, and all these young people will see it. That's great.
On your planned mission to Mars, how many people do you want to bring, and what kind of experiments do you want to do on the surface?
How many people?
How many people do you want to take up to Mars, and what experiments do you want to do?
Yeah. Well, I'd say a crew of about maybe 4 or maybe 6, something on that scale. Probably not 12 or 20, and probably not 2. So experiments will probably be of many different types. A lot of physiological experiments, and also a lot of experiments to learn to live off the land. This is one of the most important things we have to do when we get to another planet, is to learn to use the resources there to be able to sustain ourselves. There's plenty of energy. We got plenty of power and energy to do things, but you know, gotta live off the land. You can't just bring everything in, you know, stored cans and frozen. So
when you listen to the infrastructure by the Planetary Society, the Mars Society, billionaires like Musk and Bezos, they're looking at the typical 8-month out, stay for 50, 8-month back, which is costly and dangerous. Yeah. You seem to have a program that's going to work. Why haven't they embraced it? Is it political? Is it money? Is it time? What?
I think there is a rush, a desire to go. You know, I think people are a little frustrated because, you know, after all, it has taken us 50 years, and we could maybe have developed these technologies in the half a century that we've had. And so people are a little frustrated that we haven't really, you know, pushed forward to go to Mars. And so they want to go no matter what. And okay, well, that's okay. But I think that mission would be very fragile. It would be very likely that we lose the crew. If we lose a crew en route to Mars, it would be a horrible thing because we'll watch it for months and we won't be able to do anything about it. And it will set the program back by maybe another 50 years or more. So I just think that maybe it's time for us to do the homework that we need to do, get it done, and then do the mission that really has all the chances to survive. Give the astronauts a fighting chance. That's what I think. Okay.
Hi, my friend and I are engineers, so we have some technical questions about your spaceship, which looks really cool. Number one, why is do the superconducting magnets you have not interfere with any electronics? How does that work? And two, you talked about how hot your plasma gets. Why does that matter? Why does it matter that it's hot?
That's a great question. Okay, the superconducting magnets are very powerful. They have magnetic fields of the order of maybe 5 to 8 Tesla. This is maybe 2 or 3 times more than what you get in an MRI machine. When you get in an MRI machine in a hospital, you are getting inside a superconducting magnet. You probably maybe don't realize that. Maybe it's not so good that you, yeah, it's safe, don't worry. But those magnets are operating at minus 268 degrees centigrade below zero. So it's liquid helium was circulating through those magnets, extremely cold. So these magnets that we are talking about are going to be operating at much higher temperatures. They're going to operate at the liquid hydrogen temperatures, which would be more like 25 degrees Kelvin, so much hotter than the liquid helium. They will use the liquid hydrogen, which we use as a propellant, to cool themselves. So this is kind of a double job. And they will shield the particles that are coming are charged particles. So these particles are going to be bent. The trajectory is going to be bent by the magnetic field so that they do not penetrate into the crew habitat. As far as the rocket temperature, you know, the hotter the rocket exhaust is, the better the rocket. It's a pretty simple relationship in that a rocket's performance is very much related to the speed of the exhaust. The higher the speed of the exhaust, the better the rocket. And the higher the speed of the exhaust, the higher the temperature. The hotter that exhaust is, the higher the speed. And the reason is that, you know, in rockets, you have a choice. You either throw stuff out the back at a low speed, or a lot of stuff out the back at low speed, or a little bit of stuff at high speed. It's like if you're in a boat and you have a bunch of, you know, bowling balls, and you push yourself by throwing the bowling balls off the boat. You know, okay, you can do that, and the boat will move. You can throw the balls and you move. But you got to carry all those bowling balls on the boat, and they're heavy, so the boat is not going to move very much. Instead, what you can do is have a high-powered rifle and have the little bullets and fire that rifle, and you'll move the same. But you carry less bullets. So
great. Just to let you know, we have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions.
Okay.
Yes.
So, you said you were, you said that you had gone on this, you had been on a space shuttle 7 times, and I was just wondering, what do you think you learned on those flights?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you one thing that I learned in all the flights, because I flew so many times over many years, I was able to see changes in the Earth over many years. And one thing I saw, like the United States at night, was dark in the central part of the United States, and very light, a lot of light in the eastern seaboard. But over time, the lights got more and more numerous as you moved west. So the population of the US has grown. The population of the planet has grown. I think one thing that I've learned is that this planet is coming quickly to the limits of the humanity that it can sustain. No matter how efficient we are, there come to be a moment when there's just too many. And we are doing nothing now more than ensuring our survival by learning to be a multi-planet species, that we can move out, that we can be in other places, and only not the Earth be the only place. So this is the kind of things that I've learned in seven flights space. Great question. Thank you.
Hello. You mentioned all the space debris that's been accumulating out there up to the moon and perhaps beyond.
Space debris. Yeah. Well, space debris is a growing problem. And
well, my question, if I could just finish. Yeah. My question, that debris is out there. What is the plan to dispose of it, assuming it's poisoned with radiation at this point?
No, there's not much debris that is radioactive. There are a few pieces way back from the Cold War that are nuclear based, but they are in very high orbits. They're safe. The debris that I'm talking about is much lower in what we call LEO, low Earth orbit. This is where all the little satellites are and all the satellites that give us our GPS and tell us where the next restaurant is or where, where all those satellites are there. The problem with the debris is that as soon as you have a collision, then you amplify this debris. You have a lot of fragments, and each one of those fragments is moving at hypervelocities. And there is a potential, if enough of these collisions occur, that you get to a point where that layer of orbital space becomes essentially unsuitable for life, or maybe unsuitable for any other satellite to live there, because you cannot get out of the way. There's just too many maneuvers to get out of the way, and it's just impossible to live there. It's just too much stuff. And that's called the Kessler syndrome, and it was predicted by an engineer at NASA a long time ago. It hasn't really happened, but it is one thing that we worry about. So we want to capture these pieces before they collide. There is no real regulation at this moment worldwide to reduce the debris in a coordinated way. Oh. But people are becoming more aware of it and learning to address it, and there's a lot of discussion going on this.
So are you going to bring it back home to Earth?
There are two choices. Some debris, you can bring it down to where it starts to skim the atmosphere and eventually slows down. It becomes a very pretty shooting star, and we think it's a shooting star, but it's not really. It's just a piece of junk that it just came. But it's okay. But okay, that's one way, and that's the less expensive way of getting rid of the debris. But it's not so great to be dumping it all on the Earth. The other way is to lift it up to higher and higher orbits and put them in graveyards. There are some ideas of having orbital graveyards where you just leave all this stuff and let it be polluted there. And there is yet another way, which requires a plasma engine, of course, that you will gather all this material and launch it on a trajectory to the sun and dump it into the sun. And that is a very nice ecological, processor, because that's where it all came from. So
we have time for one last question, if you can answer it briefly.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
What is your favorite part of a space flight?
What's your favorite part of space flight?
Favorite part is the launch. Well, I guess I have to say the launch is one of my favorites. Probably the nicest, most exciting one is walking outside. Opening the hatch and taking a spacewalk. That is a pretty impacting moment. So thank you so much for your questions. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. You got it all figured out.
Thank you, Franklin. That was really fascinating and terrific. I am now delighted to introduce Daniel Burbank, who served as a NASA astronaut from 1996 to 2018. During his career, Burbank logged a total of 188 days in space and 7 hours and 11 minutes of spacewalk time, including preparation of the International Space Station for the first permanent crew and 163 days aboard the International Space Station, He is currently a Senior Technical Fellow for Mission Systems at Collins Aerospace Systems. And Dan has kindly agreed to answer questions following his presentation. Please help me welcome Daniel Burbank.
All right, well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure and it's an honor to be with you today. And it's an absolute joy to see my friend and long-term colleague, Franklin. We choose to go to the moon and do the other things. That speech, those words by JFK, actually served as the activation energy to essentially extend human presence and do this absolutely remarkable thing, and that is to go to the moon 50 years ago today. I was a little bit younger than Franklin when that happened. It was just about a week before my 8th birthday, and actually stayed up late that night. Got my folks to let me do that, and here, give me one second. And the landing actually occurred in the afternoon, of course, and then but the spacewalk itself, when Neil and Buzz actually set foot on the moon, was really late, at least for a 7, almost 8-year-old. For me, that had a big impact, as it did lots and lots of young folks across the United States and, in fact, the world. And I'd like to tell you that made me want, at that instant, to become an astronaut, but that's actually not true. It never occurred to me as a young kid that was something that was even conceivable. Just was out of the question. But from that point on, it made me just passionately interested in the space program. It made me learn how to build telescopes. It made me learn how to grind the mirrors of very large telescopes, and it also made me follow the space program throughout my career as I was growing up. So just kind of a couple pictures. So, of course, this was the big momentous event. And, of course, a lot of things had happened before that. In fact, I was born on the year that Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard flew, 1961. So the space program, as I was just a baby to a toddler to a young boy, was in its very inception. It was at the very, very beginning. Turns out this stuff's really hard to do. I thought probably as a kid in those days that by now we'd have hundreds of people living in space, and or at least maybe even hundreds living on Mars, and maybe thousands living in a permanent basis in space, low Earth orbit, on the surface of the moon. It's a really, really tough thing to do, and probably it's the hardest thing that human beings have ever tried to do. Right now, though, we're right at the dawn of what I would consider to be the real start of the space age. This is the point where it actually becomes economically feasible. We had always, at NASA, always knew that there was ways to return the first stage, the big pieces of the rocket, and land it back and not throw it away every time. But the physics and all the engineering involved probably made it not practical in the early days. And it really took the gradual development of subsequent vehicles and ultimately the space shuttle to get a little bit of reusability, and then most recently, of course, with SpaceX and companies like Blue Origin as well, figuring out a way to recover perhaps at some point all of the pieces of the rocket. The first stage, we see those land on drone ships off the coast. We see them land sometimes at the beach. It actually makes the engineering problem a little bit harder. You've got to carry some extra gas to be able to do that. But it turns out it is viable, and that's what fundamentally will change the calculus of going to space. So it actually is something feasible. So when Neil and Buzz were on the moon, I watched them on TV like everybody else. 500 million people probably around the world. But I really saw them for real with the binoculars. That's me on the left-hand side with the corduroy pants and the knee patches, and that's my sister Suzanne on the right-hand side, and she's got her binoculars. And then right between us is our family friend, longtime friend, Neil Johnson, who I was very jealous of for obvious reasons, because he shared that name with somebody else really important. But we were really convinced that we were actually able to see the space program. So for me personally, this was a watershed moment. It's probably the biggest formative event that ultimately set me on a trajectory that got me to NASA. But again, it didn't make me want to be an astronaut. A year later, I saw this silly Walt Disney movie called The Boatniks, and it was about a fellow who graduates from the Coast Guard Academy, and he goes out and has just a bunch of adventures and things. But from that point on, from about the time I was 9, as long as I can remember, I wanted to go charging out in the surf in Coast Guard boats and rescue people. So that was really my dream that maybe I thought was a little more realistic than where I eventually found myself. So I went to the Coast Guard Academy, and the very first night, after doing a lot of push-ups with the rest of my new recruits, I realized as I was reading through this little training book that told you all the things, all the missions that the Coast Guard did, and all the things that if an upperclassman got in your face, you had to be ready to just, tell them quickly. And I realized to my horror that the only people that can't be on Coast Guard small boats charging out in the surf, saving lives, are officers. So it's our enlisted force that actually do that. And officers, don't, typically go on those kinds of boats. So I was shocked. I mean, this is all I'd ever wanted to do. So there's a message somewhere in there about researching your career goals. But to my surprise, as I read a couple more pages past that point, it talked about the Coast Guard had C-130 airplanes. Wow, that's interesting. And they also had helicopters. And I'd never thought about aviation, but I realized as I read about what the helicopters do, that was the only thing that you could, as an officer, directly participate in life-saving. You could be with a small team of folks, a rescue swimmer, a flight mechanic, a pilot, and a co-pilot, and you can go charging out 300 miles offshore and rescue people. And so I'd never thought about being a pilot until then, but I never stopped. My entire time at the Coast Guard Academy, that's what I wanted to do. So I graduated, and then I ended up doing exactly what I thought. I went to flight school. I learned how to fly Coast Guard H-3 helicopters and H-60s. I flew in the perfect storm, and lots of other cases, and actually got to be part of just a really small part of a huge organization that's dedicated in humanitarian purposes to save lives and property at sea. But I continued making telescopes, and there's one of mine right there. And then the third formative event really happened to me, and that was this Coast Guard officer and helicopter pilot named Bruce Melnick applied for the astronaut program. And I was just at my first unit, which was Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and the shock, my goodness, somebody who flies helicopters for the Coast Guard, not necessarily a fighter pilot or something, can actually get picked up by NASA. So I made it my life's mission from that point on to every 2 years send an application, usually getting denied, send another application. And on my third time over 6 years, interviewing each of those times, I finally got picked up. And in the meantime, I got to do lots and lots of Coast Guard missions. I lived in, Mobile, Alabama, in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, right here in Cape Cod. Learned how to fly in fog. Went up to Alaska, learned how to fly in snow, and eventually found my way to NASA. So that's kind of my biography from a kind of a personal sense. But it really, thanks. But really, there was that one crystallizing event early on that made me interested in space. And again, the message for the young kids here right now and that are out in our schools is, you have no idea what you're capable of. You have no idea what the future holds in store for you. Franklin had mentioned about, failure is an option. That's pretty much, there's nothing I did that was ever of significant worth that I ever succeeded at the first time, regardless. And so I think the message to everybody is, there's a tendency, we try something, and if it doesn't work, well, that's it. I guess that's not meant for me. I'll find another path. And that's exactly not the answer for kids. So you ought to see yourself in the future, in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, designing and building spaceships, spacesuits, flying on those spacecraft, doing spacewalks on those spacesuits. We are, again, right now at the point where we're talking about sustainable human presence in space. And by sustainable, I mean sustainable in all the positive senses, but also in the sense that we need to go there and go there to stay, to actually extend on a permanent basis human presence. And it becomes economically viable, and that is what's the engine that ultimately makes us do it more often. And if we do it more often, we do it more safely. And so this is really the bright, dawning of the space age. Okay, so I'm going to kind of just talk to you real quick. I shudder to talk about a typical space shuttle mission when I've only got 2 under my belt, when the most flown space shuttle crew member ever just spoke to you. But I'm going to try to give you just a little flavor of what it's like to do a space shuttle mission, and then I'm going to compare and contrast that to what it's like to do an International Space Station expedition mission. So shuttle missions are typically 1 to 2 weeks long. You know, when we were doing those, they're very, very hectic. The crew is very focused. Every second, every minute, certainly, of time on orbit for a space shuttle was critical. So you had 600 people, smartest people in the world, walking through the door every 24 hours at mission control, figuring out how to optimize everything you're going to do. But you spent a lot of time and you practiced and you knew your mission inside and out, and you barely knew you were in space because you were so busy. You didn't have time to really become a creature of space, to adapt into what it's like to be in that environment. But my gosh, it was absolutely incredible. There was at the very end of a shuttle mission, everybody's a little down in the mouth and depressed because they're having to return, or actually not that, they're having to leave this magical place. But I would tell you, at the end of a 6-month mission, and you're configuring your currently now Soyuz, but soon we hope, your SpaceX Dragon, or your Starliner, your Boeing Starliner, to return after 6 months or a year in space station, when you're packing up all your toys and you're having to say goodbye to that magical place again, you'll feel the same little twinge of depression because you're having to leave this. You're going back to your family. That's absolutely crucial. And one of my crewmates, Don Pettit, would say, if you could bring your family with you up there, you might not ever have to come back at all, which is probably an exaggeration, but not a really big one. So I'm going to talk you through one of my last shuttle missions, and that was STS-115. We're bringing up a big 35,000-pound payload to essentially double the power output of space station. So this is in 2006. So crew of 6 in this case. We usually like to fly 7. Payload was so heavy we couldn't actually have a 7th crew member. So we spend a lot of time training. We train in simulators. We learn how to land the shuttle, which is this really crazy, fast, very steep approach to a landing. And we have an airplane that we can make behave like a shuttle only by having the thrust reversers, the things that slow you down in an airliner when you land here, have the thrust reversers deploy in flight, run the engines at nearly full throttle, trying to pull you backwards up the glide slope. So you're going at 300 knots, screaming at the dirt. Instead of a 3-degree glide path, more like a 20-degree glide path. And crews will do 500 of those before their first landing in a shuttle, and more typically 1,000 or more. We have lots of other simulators to teach us about space station and about the robotic arms that we have on station and on shuttle. We have new simulators right now that are teaching crews how to fly the Boeing Starliner and the SpaceX Crew Dragon. And we spend a lot of time in other kinds of simulators. We learn about the spacewalking piece. Franklin said that's the most remarkable and rewarding. I would second that. We don't do this very often. So this is a fundamental change in how we're going to be. We need to consider designing spacesuits and things. Right now, it's certainly dangerous to put on that spacesuit and go outside the space station. So we don't do it unless we really have to. So if you're a crew member on station and you don't have a planned spacewalk, the whole time you're up there in the evening when an alarm goes off in the middle of the night, everybody comes pouring out of their crew quarters and we're all high-fiving, hoping that something just serious enough for you to go outside, but not serious enough for you to have to come home. You're hoping that you're right in that sweet spot where you get to climb in a spacesuit. But fundamentally, we need to be thinking in a different way. We need to be thinking about spacesuits that can support not just every 3 or 4 or 6 months going outside, but every day, or at least every other day. And that's, spacewalk will become the norm. But it's really hard to do it. The spacesuit and you weigh about 500 pounds, so we usually do the spacewalks. We practice them underwater, where you and the suit collectively are neutrally buoyant in the water column. In the shuttle days, we spent a lot of time in the shuttle simulator, but we also had very flight-specific training. So this mission here was the first space station assembly mission after we lost the Columbia crew. So a lot of our training and a lot of our planning and engineering development was geared towards how to inspect a space shuttle. Should there be an impact from foam or other orbital debris, how to inspect it and repair the kind of damage you'd have. So, and then, of course, all the spacewalk things. There's the payload we're bringing up. So again, 35,000 pounds, big as a school bus, got 240 feet worth of solar rays, tip to tip, that generate about 65 kilowatts of power, all tucked away in little boxes and with appendages that are all securely fastened, that once we attach this to the space station, we'll deploy and release. The shuttle would go out to the pad about 30 days or so before launch. And then we would join the shuttle down at Kennedy Space Center about a week before launch. And we would get a chance to come and visit a couple times. Right before launch, the night before, we would have typically a night viewing, and it's just spectacular to see it like that. Fueling takes place around, we start tanking the external tank at about 8 hours or so before launch. You've trained usually for a shuttle mission about a year to a year and a half, thereabouts. Although my first shuttle mission was a 6-month flow, this, because of Columbia, we were assigned before the Columbia accident, this ended up being 5 years worth of training. So these are your brothers and sisters, these are your family, you've spent so much time together. Okay, so this is what a shuttle launch is like. These are just some kind of ballpark numbers. Sitting on the pad, a shuttle would weigh about 4.5 million pounds. Landing weight's about 200,000 pounds. So there's not a whole lot that comes back, with the exception that the solid rocket boosters, we would land, they'd come down in parachutes, a ship would bring them back ashore, we'd clean them up and refuel them again. Each of the shuttle main engines would, and by the way, those same engines are what we're going to use on the SLS rocket. Space Launch System rocket is the deep space Saturn V-like rocket that will launch the Orion spacecraft to the moon and beyond. So we actually are going to use shuttle engines for that. We'll have 4 of them on the bottom. They each generate about 500,000 pounds of thrust. The total thrust, when you add the solid rocket boosters, each generating 3 million pounds of thrust, so 6 plus another 1.5 million, you're 7.5, bumping up against 8 million pounds of thrust. It's a fantastic ride. Again, like Franklin said, highly recommend it. Very exciting. Takes about 8.5 minutes to get to space, and by that I mean not just to get to space, but to get at that magic speed you need to be there, 17,500 miles an hour. 8 kilometers a second, very, very fast, so that you stay there. So the solid rocket boosters are burning, each of them 5 tons per second of fuel. The main engines are gobbling up 1,000 gallons per second each. So if you were just ballpark, just estimate how much fuel you're burning on the way uphill, it's about 6.7 feet per gallon. That's your mileage. Yeah, it's the mileage on the way uphill. So that's not the best, but that's the fact, the physics of living on an 8,000-mile rock called planet Earth. But then when you get to space for a shuttle mission, you're going to spend 10, 15 days or so orbiting the Earth very, very fast with low burn rates. So you're going to get a mission gas mileage of about 8 miles per gallon. Okay. So here's what a launch is like. So this is the vehicle. We would start the shuttle main engines about 6 seconds before launch, let them throttle up, and the computers on board check them out. If everything is all good, and you'll see an inset, that's us, and that's me on the foreground left side. So there's a little bit of motion with the solid rocket boosters. At the end of 6 seconds, if all is well, we light the solid rocket boosters, and you can see us bouncing around there. You almost can't read the instruments. It's a pretty exciting ride. So you basically are going about 100 miles an hour by the time the tail clears the pad. So the thrust-to-weight ratio is very, very high relative to a Saturn V, for example. And by 43 seconds, we're going through the speed of sound, so you can see the shock wave kind of build up around the vehicle. The solid rocket boosters are doing most of the work, and they're going to be empty at about 2 minutes in. So there's the shock waves building up. And as soon as they're empty, we basically will jettison those because they're just at that point dead weight that would prevent us from getting uphill. So here's a view from the solids looking at the rest of the orbiter headed uphill with the 3 main engines doing all the work now under the power of the liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen coming out of the external tank. So it's shocking how smooth the ride is once the solids are gone. Solids just burn in a very sort of chaotic, very high vibration sort of way. But under the space shuttle main engines, it's really, really smooth. After Columbia, we would do, as soon as we disconnect from the external tank, because it's just going to tumble and burn up in the atmosphere, we would do a very, very quick, almost immediate backflip, 180 degrees, so that we could look out the overhead windows and take very, very close-up pictures. So it's the external tank looks about as close as the back of the wall is here. Back in the day, we would get the external tank further away before we would do that maneuver, but it got you high enough resolution imagery to know that there was no missing foam, for example. That might have been a problem. This is what the station looked like. It's much bigger than that now, but that's what it looked like when we got there. There's 1 set of solar rays. We're bringing up a second. This is the crew that's there waiting for us. What they're doing there, and they're smiling and happy, but what they've spent the last several days doing is lashing everything down. just strapping stuff down, you know, really, really securely. When you're an expedition crew member, you get very efficient at living and working in space. And even when veterans crew members, you know, first dock to station and cross the hatch, they're clumsy. They're just like bull in a china closet and they're bouncing off the walls and everything is coming loose. You can generally find them because there'll be a trail of debris behind them. So you got to kind of just doing slow rolls. So this is Jeff Williams in the front left there, Pavel Vinogradov in the front right, and Tomas Ryder in the back. And we, in 2 days, will catch up the station, we'll dock to it, and it's this very, very small, tenuous sort of attaching mechanism between the two. And there's a tunnel that we can go back and forth from station, so that's a view. We immediately get to work, and we're going to use the space station's robotic arm, but first we're going to pick this 35,000-pound payload out of the payload bay with a shuttle arm, and then we're going to present it to the station arm, use that, and then attach the payload to the outer part of the truss. So that's Steve McLean getting ready to fly the station arm, and I'm firing up the space shuttle arm. And then we're going to do this extraction. Now it's a little bit like that game Operation where you're trying to pick up the funny bone, and there's only about 1.5 inches of clearance on the sides of the payload from like important stuff like this is a orbiter boom sensor system on the right-hand side there. So in the shuttle arm flies beautifully. We very carefully lift this up. It's kind of a fairly slow affair, but you want to be real careful. We're also very, very close to space station structure there as well. And then it basically rolls over the port payload bay edge there, the sill. And then there's another grapple fixture. You can see that's on the right-hand side, kind of center height. And then Steve grapples to it with the space station robotic arm, which is a much bigger one. Both of these are Canadian contributions to the space station and shuttle. And then we basically attach it to the structure. Now inside we can issue commands that'll actually drive motorized bolts that'll mechanically attach it, but then we've got a lot of work to do to go outside and connect all of the nervous system and the vascular system, if you will, to that. So that's what it looks like when it's all done. And the very next day we start doing spacewalks. So it's several days of spacewalks to go and do all the activation to basically get the solar rays and the radiators on that payload ready to extend. It's the first thing that strikes you when you do a spacewalk, I don't know, Franklin, if you feel the same way, but every time you've done this, and you probably have done it 10 to 1, maybe 15 times to every spacewalk you do on the real day, you go out the airlock in the pool, and there's a cloud of divers, and they're really smart, and they know exactly what you need to do, and on the real day, there's nobody. They just don't show up for work that day. And the place you're going to, unlike in the old days where you're always like 55 feet away from the shuttle airlock, we go one heck of a long way away from the airlock on station. We could be 300 feet plus away from home plate. So, but anyway, so we go out there, we connect the umbilicals that route the power and the data, and there's cooling system fluids that are there as well. And then we have to mechanically open the blanket boxes that actually contain those 240 feet worth of solar rays. And every now and then, if you get a little bit ahead, the ground, you have a chance to kind of enjoy the view a bit because the ground's kind of catching up maybe to what you're doing. But it's a real busy time. And there's our spacesuit. Yeah, almost life-size. So it's a spacecraft, and Sue Curley's going to be here a little bit later. Oh, there she's here. She just walked in, and Sue's going to tell you about that, and then about some plans for future spacewalks. But you carry all your tools in the front with you as well. It's got a little jet backpack on the back, so should you become detached to station through inattention or hardware malfunction, you have a way to actually deploy a little hand controller and then fly yourself back to space station, kind of like a parachute. But it's fantastic. So you can grab 1 million pounds of space station and just kind of stuff it behind your back if you get a quiet moment. And then there's nothing human-made in your field of view, and you're just flying over the Himalayas at 17,500 miles an hour like Superman. It's just absolutely spectacular. So. And that's the view from Atlantis once we got everything attached and the blanket blocks are deployed, and now we're ready to, the next day, we do all this inside. We actually issue commands, and there's motors and mechanisms that'll actually pull out those blankets, and that's one set of them, and they go a long way the other direction as well, and again, they make about 65 kilowatts of power. So a little bit about living in space, on space station, on a shuttle mission. You just have a couple of days, where there's things settled down enough for you to have a meal and kind of celebrate the things you're doing. and the crew hosted us for that. There's some just habitability things, house cleaning kinds of things you do in space shuttles, which are not so critical, but on space station, they're absolutely a must. We spend essentially our whole Saturdays tidying things up there. We sleep kind of hanging like bats upside down, sidewise or what have you, in sleeping bags. The mission can be so busy that on a shuttle mission, you might be lucky to get 5 hours of sleep on a night, typically. When you do have some spare time, everybody just makes a beeline for the windows because, you know, the views of planet Earth are the thing that's so striking. So everybody's fighting for window space. You might get a chance to see Mount Etna or some other volcanoes. You might get a chance to see home. And there's our Cape and Islands and Boston kind of to the left and a little bit to the right. And it's kind of an interesting shot because there's some sun glint. The sun is reflecting off of the ocean, and you can see the Labrador currents coming from the north and the Gulf Streams coming up from the lower left here from the south, and they interact and create these eddies that are pretty spectacular. We had a little bit extra gas, so we did a quick lap around Mars. But actually, you know, there's sometimes, like we're a water planet mostly, but then next to that we're a sand planet. So there's lots and lots of desert, and that's pretty striking sometimes. And that's what everything looked like from the very back window of Space Station, looking forward to Atlantis, which is up there in the right-hand background there. And then we left. Very shortly thereafter. There's not enough hydrogen and oxygen to power the electrical system on shuttles. So shuttle, the limiter was the amount of power you could make. And on Space Station, power is almost kind of free. So we get it once we have the solar rays up there, courtesy of the sun. And we left it a little bit asymmetrical, but another crew squared that away very shortly thereafter. And then you land, and it's been this whirlwind thing that, you know, experience that maybe you don't even remember all the things that happened because it was so busy. We're a little wobbly when we land after a 2-week mission, and, you know, frankly, we're a little more tired, I would argue, than we are after a 6-month mission on shuttle missions, because the tempo of operations almost doesn't really allow you to do the exercise that humans really need to do in space to prevent all the deleterious effects of space. But on Space Station, it's a priority. So 2.5 hours a day, crews are exercising, 1.5 hours of that strength and 1 hour of that weight training. Cardiovascular training. So I'm going to give you a kind of quick ISS expedition, just kind of talking the comparing and contrast the differences, and I'm going to shamelessly regale you with some pictures from space. So on a shuttle mission, we don't get enough time to really get good at the cameras. It kind of takes about a month or two on a space station mission before you really get good. And we've got great cameras, and they can take pictures all by themselves once you set them up nicely. So I've got a few that other crews have, and then a whole bunch that we took. All right, so there's our mission. That was the one that I was the commander of, Expedition 30. We launch with the Soyuz crew. It's a crew of 3 these days. When we launch on commercial crew soon, it'll be probably a crew of 4, typically. So it'll be 2 U.S., probably a Russian, and then another international partner from station from the ISS program. That'll fly on those as well. But a Soyuz is a really small, relative to a space shuttle, shockingly small vehicle. So we are a long ways away from each other relative to how we'd have to be in the Soyuz. So you're just going to be completely wedged against each other. You're going to have straps over your shoulders, and you're going to have a waist strap as well. And then you're going to have each of your knees will be tied to your chest. You'll be in a little tiny human cannonball for a good long time. When you get to station, you're going to meet up with another crew of 3 from another Soyuz that's already there. You'll overlap a bit for them, and then halfway through your mission, typically another crew will come up. So Expedition 30 had all those folks there. So my Soyuz crewmates, Anton Shkaplerov and Anatoly Ivanishin, are behind me there, and then Oleg Kononenko is on the right-hand side foreground. Don Pettit behind him towards the right, and Andrei Kuipers of the Netherlands is in the center in the back there. So a crew of 6 is usually what we have on station these days. Training flow for a shuttle mission was very, very focused on, you know, a lot of time in the simulator, a lot of time practicing spacewalks, all the operational things you can do so that you can do them flawlessly, essentially, and be pretty much ready to do anything, including the anomalies and the contingency kind of planning. Space station training is a whole different affair. You know, with a 1 million pound mass space station, in 6 months you're going to spend up there, we don't have the ability to train to the level of detail on every task and subtask you're going to do. So we do what's called skills-based. We just give you a lot of theory. You'll do just a handful of simulations instead of doing maybe 500 ascent and entry runs for a space station or a space shuttle flight. You might do maybe a couple of dozen, and then you'll maybe do 2 or 3 all-day life aboard space station kind of simulations. But you go up there with a lot of understanding about how the space station works, and you're essentially going to just take care of things and learn as you go and do things in a little bit more measured pace. But for the vehicles that get you to and from station, we always have to worry about survival training. On station, we worry about the big 3, which are fire, depressurization, and then a toxic atmosphere release, so perhaps ammonia or something like that. Shuttles we launch when the weather's great, not just at Florida, but they're great across in Europe at our transatlantic abort sites. Rockets don't much care a whole lot about the weather. The reason why we like the weather to be good in the shuttle was if you ever had to come back because something happened on the way uphill, you wanted to be able to land in good, clear conditions. With a capsule, it doesn't really matter. You're going to come back wherever you come back. The rocket doesn't care about snow, blizzards, or all the rest. So this was when the weather broke, where you could actually see. But when we first got to the base of the rocket, and by the way, there's a crew right now, the Expedition 60 crew is in a rocket just like this, down in Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and at the end, in about, MECO for them, that is insertion with the vehicle with them safely in orbit, will be exactly 1 hour from now. So there'll be a little chance, maybe we'll actually get to watch their launch if you like. But anyways, you'd show up there and you'd climb aboard the vehicle, and as long as you had 2 meters of visibility across the capsule, that's good enough, and we're going to launch this. So there's the view of you in the Soyuz, and again, you are absolutely wedged against each other, and if you had any tendency towards claustrophobia, this would not be the vehicle for you. And if you're an old guy with kind of some sore joints and things like that, at the end, when you finally get to unstrap and unfold yourself from the seat, it's a long process and a little bit painful, but you're going to a great place. So we spent 2 days in that vehicle, and I think that's life size, so it's about that big, maybe slightly bigger. But it's a nice little sports car, and the place you're going to is just magnificent. That's space station now, and anything but life size. Again, big as a football field and a 1 million pound mass, and so big that while you're up there, sometimes you might spend 45 minutes trying to find one of your crewmates because they're somewhere in this giant rabbit warren of laboratories and airlocks and other kinds of things. Just a wonderful place. So since you've been in the Soyuz, this is even bigger still. So again, that's roughly what you're looking at, almost a 1 million pound mass. There's the velocities. I'm going to give you not the SI units here, 250 miles above Earth, and a decent amount of power, but we're going to need a whole bunch more to get ourselves quickly to the destinations we're really aiming for. This is an atypical, I would say, not really a typical day, but we do a lot of operational stuff on station in kind of spurts. There'll be a cluster of activities associated with an EVA, a spacewalk. There might be a lot of training and preparation, and then some pretty exciting robotics work leading up to the arrival of a cargo vehicle that you might have to snatch out of thin air, so to speak, very thin air, and dock it to station. But most of what we do on station typically is the science that station was built for. So some of the operational kind of things, again, the station crews, so there's a crew on board right now that's lashing things down, getting ready for this crew that's going to dock later on. But they're also going to be monitoring that entire approach as that Soyuz does dock, bringing up Drew Morgan, Alexander Skvortsov, and Luca Parmitano. Here's one of the cargo vehicles. This is a Japanese HTV, so it's coming up full of about 6,000 pounds of cargo. And this one comes up all by itself. So it's got an automated rendezvous and guidance system. And as it gets close to the very back of station, just before docking, it's very, very the motion control system very active to very precisely constrain the trajectory and rates and stuff as the vehicle comes in. You're monitoring this on a TV screen, and you also have lots of telemetry, and you're hoping maybe it'll misbehave a bit so you can take over and fly it in manually, but usually they do just fine. And some of the vehicles, though, are designed to come up and just rendezvous in Flywood Station, and then you catch them with the station's robotic arm. So actually, I misspoke. That last one was the European Automated Transfer Vehicle. This is the Japanese HTV, which is designed to come up like the SpaceX Dragon, and the Northrop Grumman Cygnus comes up, and then it ends up outside your window, and you catch it in flight like this. Some of the other operational things, again, that never happens quite enough for any of us is the spacewalks, and it's an all-hands affair. Everybody on station supporting that crew that's out there, and then people all around the world in mission control centers that are doing it as well. A lot of the time you spend really is doing science. So this is a combustion physics experiment I'm getting ready to do, and we learned some interesting things about how things combust in microgravity. And it's always fun to be able to do an experiment with fire. We do some other basic kinds of science that include some basic fluid physics experiments. So this one's called the capillary flow experiment. And the inset there on the right-hand side kind of shows up close what Joe Akaba is seeing there. We do our own. We always play with our food, so we do kind of our informal amateur experiments all the time. It's irresistible. Some of the work we do on station is maturation of different kinds of engineering technology. So we had a robonaut up there for quite a while, and we did the initial checkouts on that robot. It's not often that a payload actually becomes a part of the crew. So we actually had robonaut doing things that humans aren't particularly good at or get very bored with. And basically, with this probe, robonauts having to measure about 30 different positions what the velocity and mass flow rates were for the part of the air revitalization system. We do a lot of life sciences. A lot of the work that the NASA-based research on ISS is geared towards trying to figure out how to keep humans safe and healthy in space so that we can responsibly say, yes, we're ready to send them to Mars, powered by a VASIMR rocket. Some of those aren't the most pleasant. This was the bane of my time on station, which is it's a VO2 max experiment that we're basically doing on a vibration isolated cycle ergometer, and it took so long to get set up, and it was really, really hard work up there. We actually are studying how the brain adapts, and you become a creature of 3 dimensions. Your ability to navigate in 3 dimensions actually has a step function improvement about 3 to 4 weeks into the mission, and understanding how that all happens is interesting. Here's one thing that we do in space right now that we never used to do, which I think is kind of a big deal. In the history of the U.S. space program, whenever we would fly spacecraft, we'd fly them for a short period of time, and if there were capsules, we'd bring the capsule back, and we would give it to a museum or what have you. But you'd be flying a new piece of hardware. And when bad things happened, as they occasionally would, with Apollo 13, for example, you would have a lot of smart people on the ground talking you through a way to adapt, for example, in that case, the lunar module's environmental control system to allow that crew to have just enough oxygen and just enough CO2 scrubbing and just enough power to be able to make a free return lap around the moon and then safely return to Earth. But generally speaking, things typically, bad things don't very often happen. But again, you're flying new hardware. In the case of the shuttle years, you would fly an essentially new piece of hardware that had been under the love and care of a whole team of engineers and technicians who were the very same people, or very trained to the same level of people that actually built those vehicles. So you would fly it new, you'd fly it for a couple of weeks, and you'd bring it back. So if you're going to be Scotty, if you will, on Star Trek, if you were going to be a repair person for the shuttle, we would give you a PowerPoint presentation, about 45 minutes of lectures. We'd show you some of the tools. You probably can't touch them, and it's going to be good enough, because in the end, duct tape, for the most part, would solve a lot of our problems. But on space station, early on, we said, well, it's big, it's been up there for a while, maybe we should do 2 PowerPoint presentations, and they can actually touch the tools, but maybe we don't let them actually do anything with those. So we were discovering that when you have a 1 million pound mass of space station that's been up there for 20 years with nobody that's a professional technician or engineer tending to it with just lots of pilots and physicians and scientists, it wasn't necessarily the best solution to train them that way. So we, on our crew, basically rewired the space station and put a high bandwidth, a high rate fiber optics backbone on it. We spent some time, and this is some of that work right there. So you do spend about 25% of your time upgrading or repairing station. We have a different set of standards for confined space, sort of activities for those of you that are familiar. So you can get into a really, really small place. It may be hard to see him, but there's Don Pettit's face right there behind one of our water purification racks. We had a problem with that rack where we had to actually do something that would have horrified all the engineers, where we actually took apart or took the cover off of a catalytic reactor, which is like an ultra clean kind of piece of equipment. This basically is what turns urine or wastewater from spacesuits or humidity from the atmosphere when you were sweating, working really hard on your exercise equipment, or today's coffee ultimately, and we turn it into tomorrow's coffee. So we purify all the wastewater. So the space station has got a very, very sophisticated, very successful water processing system that makes us uber recyclers. You have to be, though, if you're gonna be in space. But we were doing repairs, things far beyond what you would expect crew members, even if they were mechanical engineers with a lot of design experience to be able to do. So when I came back, so when you come back from a mission, you get 3 wishes, basically. The program will listen to your top 3 things you would fix, and the number one for me was we need to fundamentally change how we train crews. So what we do right now, people that fly in space station all don't just get a couple of PowerPoint presentations, but they go to work on the T-38 little jet airplanes that we fly, and they start out in the flight line, they're servicing jets, they're working with the technicians that work on those, they end up in the engine shop, the hydraulics shop, they're doing avionics, troubleshooting on those airplanes, and frankly, they're using the exact same tools and basically the exact kinds of techniques that we need on the space station to take care of it. So it turns out that ends up being pretty successful. Exercise, again, is a really important part of what you do. So you're running or you're on the cycloergometer an hour a day, and you're an hour and a half of strength training. Just living in space, we'll try our best, even though everybody's very busy, we try our best to sit down and have meals together at the end of the day. This is a rarity if you actually get ice cream up there. Maybe it's a little better these days, but sometimes on the shuttle missions, we would actually bring up some ice cream to the crew. Other living in space, we promise each other before we fly. You never had to get a haircut on a shuttle mission or probably the Apollo, Gemini, or Mercury missions either. But if you're going to be up there for 6 months or a year, like Scott Kelly did, you're going to need to get haircuts. We promise each other we'll practice with the clippers. We never do. We're pretty good pilots. We're pretty good engineers and scientists, but we are absolutely terrible barbers, and it goes from like one slip and a mistake to another, and then invariably, the whole crew is bald shortly thereafter. So you'll see periodically where suddenly the crew's all wearing ball caps, or they're just they're looking like that, and that's exactly what just happened. So we get to celebrate a couple of holidays during that 6 months. Again, it's fairly busy time, but we do get a day and a half typically off on the weekends, and then those holidays are real precious times. A thing that's really fundamentally different than what we did back in the shuttle days is you get to talk to your family anytime you want. You call them anytime you want. You get to see them once a week on the weekends, which is really good. And then for holidays, these are other opportunities as well. They can watch you on NASA TV all the time if they can stand that. So you have a level of connection with your family that you're able to do on a long duration mission that we never really accommodated back in the earlier days. We have a guitar up there, and we've had flutes and all kinds of other musical equipment. There's a keyboard still up there from one of the early expeditions. And we all, regardless if we started out as amateur photographers, we all become that very quickly. So we've got these great cameras. Typically in the cupola, which is our little window on the world, it's a bubble that's on the belly of the orbiter, belly of the space station. We'll have usually, what we would do in ours is we would have 4 cameras all rigged and ready for daylight imagery, and another 4 cameras all set to go for night. And sometimes they have an intervalometer where they'll just take a shot very, very quickly, and they're able to in a very fast fashion, put together one of these aurora pictures, time-lapse pictures, or these Aurora movies sometimes that we'll do. So we took about 500,000 pictures on board during our 6 months of time. So if you dropped a pixel every time there was a picture taken on the first 29 expeditions or 28 expeditions on station, that's what it would look like. If you dropped a pixel every time at the end of hours, you can almost make out planet Earth. Now, when I say we took the pictures, actually the cameras we program when they're set up, and they're kind of taking those more or less many times on their own. So that's planet Earth. This would be the view out your window in the morning, sipping from a bag of Kona coffee or something. And you have very few places in planet Earth that look quite like the Caribbean, and there's Florida top right there a little bit. I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly because this planet is spectacularly beautiful, and every now and then you'll get an opportunity. This was not our mission, but another expedition. You'll have these fortuitous opportunities to image, significant events here on planet Earth. And we think of deserts as being kind of boring and monochromatic, and this is part of the Australian outback, just gorgeous, dried lake bed. Does this look like a ridgeline to you, or does it look like a canyon? So I'm going to flip that picture upside down. How about now? That's a canyon, right? Is that a canyon? And this is the exact same picture. It's part of the Grand Canyon, actually. Because we live here on planet Earth, the sun's usually up there. The bright stuff, even in buildings and stuff, is usually up there. If there's a concave feature, and the lighting is from above, as it typically is for Earthlings, then the dark of the concave is on the top part of it, and the light part of the concave is on the bottom. So it makes us predisposed to see a concave feature that's got light on top and dark at the bottom as something that's actually convex, poking out at you. It's just a byproduct. It's the exact same picture. It's the exact same picture, but it's just a byproduct of the biases that we've evolved to have by virtue of being, Earthlings. Every now and then you get lucky, and there'll be something like this. This was a Comet Shoemaker-Levy in 2011, and this was our companion for weeks. Just this gorgeous, gorgeous view. And we could take pictures of it in IR and in visual. This is kind of a neat picture. This is zodiacal light. So the moon is there in the top center. The Hawaiian Islands, you're looking at the Pacific, Hawaiian Islands are there on the right-hand side, and there's a hazy glow that's sort of offset from the reflection of the moon off of the Pacific, and that is actually in the plane of the ecliptic, the plane of our solar system. So it's basically all the hazy bits of grains of nanoscale particles that are forward scattering. The sun's about to come up, so they're reflecting off of that, and they're all the stuff that were just too far away to coalesce and form a sun or Jupiter or Earth or you and me. So this is kind of like the primordial material that formed our solar system. These are 3 shots left to right. We typically down here see shooting stars, if you will, or meteors against a background of stars from planet Earth. In space, you see it. You basically re-enter in the atmosphere below you against a background of city lights. Earth's history is one of catastrophe on a geologic scale anyways. This is a fairly small crater in Chad, and there's a really big one, 100-kilometer one that's up in Canada called Manicouagan, and there's a close-up of it. So the center portion of that was probably molten for 10 years, and this was a really bad day for North America 200 million years ago. That stuff happens. So if we use those long lens cameras and stacked a bunch of images, this would be what Manhattan would look like during the day or at night. And you can pick out Central Park probably, and you see the lights of Times Square and that part of Manhattan pretty clearly as well. There's a city in Europe. Yeah, London. Okay. And again, some desert shots. This is part of the Namib Desert in Namibia. So there's very few human-made structures, single structures that you can actually see from space. And this is, of course, zoomed in, but these are the Great Pyramids, and they're right at the western edge of Cairo, which is at the apex of the Nile River Delta. And if you know where to look, and the sun is just risen, they'll cast a shadow across the desert, and it'll draw your eyes in, and naked eye, you can actually pick them out. They don't look quite like that unless you have a camera. But you can't see the Great Wall of China. It matches the sand around there, and it's sinuous. We've seen linear features much more readily. We'll see, sandstorms over the western Sahara. Sometimes there'll be sand that'll lay up in the atmosphere like this in southern Pakistan or southern Iran and Pakistan for weeks at a time. And you're just marveling how people could actually survive underneath there. We talk about glaciers as being rivers of ice, and on a long enough time scale, they do flow. But you can, if you stand back far enough, you can get a sense that of how fluid they are. For the mechanical engineers and aerodynamicists in the world, we can, on a flow bench, we can create what's called a von Karman vortex street, or these alternating clockwise and counterclockwise swirls on a flow bench in a laboratory, just sending streamlines of bubbles, and then stick a bluff body or a circular thing in the way, and it'll cast those. And that's like on a couple meter scale. Or you can step back and fly over, just south of the Aleutian chain, and you'll see same streamlines at the very top there coming off the Alaska Peninsula, hitting two big volcanoes, and on a couple of 1,000-mile scale see that same phenomenon. And the auroras are just spectacular. And so this will happen periodically, especially if the sun has a coronal mass ejection or a solar particle event, things like that. With those same cameras, if you open up the shutter for a while and just let them stay open and just do a time-lapse picture, you might see this. So the yellow streaks are basically the sodium vapor lights of cities. Some of the greenish hues are the mercury vapor lights that are common in some places, and all those little blotches are lightning flashes. And then you've got that 100-kilometer band of Earth's atmosphere that's excited in UV. You got a little bit of zodiacal light, that haze in the top right. And here on planet Earth, if you want to do circular star trails, you would point your camera, if an astronomer, point your camera at the north star or the south celestial pole and leave the shutter open for a while. On station, it generally flies belly towards the Earth with the solar rays on the left and right side, kind of like an airplane. And so what you have to do is just point that camera out the left or right side of the truss, and you're getting an artificial set of star trails that way. There's with the fisheye lens in the cupola, that great window on the world, with a little bit of aurora there in some places. The striking thing to me is that, we have a planet of 7 billion people, and from the vantage point of 250 miles or 400 kilometers, unless you know where to look, it's not, if it's daytime, it's not even clear that there's anybody here at all. And yet we know that we are straining the resources. We are creating all kinds of problems for ourselves all around the planet. And those 7 billion people come with a pretty significant burden. There's that tiny sliver of kind of blue fuzz on the top that follows the arc of the Earth is, the part that's habitable. It's just, that's the envelope, this tiny envelope of air, which on scale is probably like the skin of an apple. And that's everything we have. And everybody you've ever known and everything that's ever happened in planet Earth and the people that designed and built rockets and all that lives there in that one thin little envelope. And we have all of our collective eggs on that basket called planet Earth. We ought to fix things here, but we ought to also go elsewhere as well, I think. So the only time, if you took that same view, the only time you can really see in a stark terms, that people live here is if you took that view and just turned the lights out, put the sun on the other side of the Earth, and then you see all the population centers, all lit up with electricity, just like Franklin was saying, how that happened over the time period of his career. You could see it across the planet Earth. So we did a little photo. We're about ready to pack up our toys and come home for Anton, Anatoly, and myself. And we climbed back, and this is the same picture as the launch day, but so it's actually worse than this because we're carrying a bunch of payloads, things that we're bringing down with us, and unfortunately we're 2 inches taller than when we started. So if it wasn't already really, really tight and cramped, it's that much more so. You get one last little view of your home for the last 6 months, and then a crazy, fiery ride in a capsule, which Scott would say is like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel on fire. And it is wild. It is it's such a different affair than it is coming in on a space shuttle, which is nice and benign and smooth. But then eventually the parachute opens and it's a nice lazy descent after that, punctuated at the very bottom by the soft landing jets, so-called soft landing jets, and then a 20G impact as the belly of the vehicle hits it's a field basically in Kazakhstan. Now, the interesting thing to me is that on the instrument panel of a Soyuz, there's a light that says Posadka, which is Russian for landing. If there's one thing that you do not need to have information on, it's the fact that you have just landed. Nothing could be, there's no mistaking, that landing. So So we get carried out kind of like the Sultan there, and you're really, really happy to be back, and gravity is just trying to turn you into a puddle of protoplasm. We get a chance to call home shortly thereafter, and then within a day, we're back in Houston, and I'll talk about that in a second. We're back in Houston, and we're with our families. Interestingly, like I said, we exercise a lot more in space station than we did on shuttle, so there is a handful of times my whole life when I could do 20 pull-ups, and one of those was the day that we got back, 24 hours after we landed, and because we spend so much time exercising on station because it's so critical. So we can protect from loss of muscular strength. We can protect, really, for the most part, for bone loss as well, which was deemed to be the showstopper for the longest time from a life sciences standpoint for deep space missions. Our heart does shrink about 25%, the stroke volume, so we actually take a hit in our cardiovascular conditioning, but it comes back at about 45 days or thereabouts. So, but I could squat more, I could bench more, and I could, like I say, and I can't do 20 pull-ups anymore, but I could that day. So that's a long duration mission. There's a whole bunch of, I'll go just quickly through this because I want to have just a few minutes for questions too. We're building 2 new spacecraft, courtesy of Boeing and SpaceX. This is the SpaceX Crew Dragon, so it's got its own rocket, and the Boeing Starliner, which launches on an Atlas V rocket. Both of those, we hope by the end of the year, to be transporting crews on, to and from space station, so that we're not dependent upon just the Russian Soyuz, that we have dissimilar redundancy and access to space. At the same time, that allows NASA to put its resources into the Orion capsule here, and the corresponding SLS rocket, which would launch it. So it's akin to the Saturn V. A lot of repurposed shuttle hardware, including the solid rocket boosters, but these are stretch versions with about 25% longer length, so they burn hotter and can lift more. And then it's got 4 space shuttle main engines at the bottom there as well. This is the view you have from space station right now. This is the view we want, and ultimately, I think this is a view that we hope to be treated to from imagery on board the vehicles that'll go to the moon in 2024. So that first mission, 2024, that NASA's targeting, which will be the first woman and next man to go to the moon, it's going to go to a very special place, too. It's going to go to the south pole of the moon, goal being that kind of late in the game, we realize there's about 100 million tons, probably at least, of water buried in the regolith and the cold traps of the south pole of the moon. So water is water, it's oxygen, and it's rocket fuel. It's hydrogen and oxygen, which is a great rocket fuel, and that hydrogen would be the perfect thing for us to use to refuel the tanks on the VASIMR rocket that will take crews to Mars. But fundamentally, going to the moon on a permanent basis where you actually learn to live off the land is a crucial skill. You're a couple of days away from planet Earth, and so if something happens, you're close to home plate, and there's always abort capability. But we have tremendous resources there in a very shallow gravity well relative to the gravity well of planet Earth. So taking advantage of that's going to be key. We want to see more of these. We'd like to see one with kind of an orange hue as well. And this is the plan that NASA's laid out between now and 2024. So a Gateway space station in orbit around the moon is the target. And from there, we would start staging landers to that South Pole site, and then eventually Gateway itself would be aggregated and grown. So you'll see a lot of different things regarding capability at the bottom that talks about the critical capability that NASA wants, that includes living off the land and being able to use that water. And also, it's a pretty harsh place as a test bed, a test environment for the hardware that you'd want to send to Mars. So it's a great way to wring that out. So Artemis 1 would be the first crew or the first mission to the, Artemis 1 is the uncrewed version. Artemis 2 is the one in 2024 to the South Pole. This is the miniature version of Space Station. The target, Space Station Gateway was going to be a larger affair. The thought now is that we'd actually be able to just fly up a propulsion element and a miniature habitation module, which are kind of to the right there. That gold one is the propulsion element, and the habitation modules there. The lander is that piece that's up in the upward side of the right. We bring crews to and from the gateway in the Orion spacecraft in the lower right, and then we'd stage those landings to the surface of the moon. By going there and having a gateway station, it allows you to reuse at least the ascent stage. If you are able to land at the exact same places, you can go, and every descent stage that you leave on the moon can form the basis for a gradually accumulating capability of resources down there. But then you can recover the ascent stage to the gateway, bring another crew up in Orion, and then use that same ascent, or bring a descent stage up, and then be able to get down there. So there's lots of launches. This would be that Artemis II mission. Gateway in its later configurations as we gradually add more international partner elements. And then ultimately, this would be the view from that South Pole location with Earth low on the horizon. And then after the initial gateway missions, there's the idea of getting into further and further sustained capability, with ultimately the moon being, or the Mars being the goal that we want to go to. So I think I probably used all the time and more than I had, so with that. So I think what we'll do is we'll take a quick break right now, and then we've got a live stream that'll be coming up of the preparations, the final preparations, and the launch of the Soyuz with the Expedition 60 crew. So they're going to launch at 12:38. We'll be back here at about 12:30, and we'll kind of talk through and watch those final preparations and watch the crew as they head uphill. So thank you.